Oh, what is going on, guys? Ferg Devoden here, and we're gonna start something new. So, I'm not really sure of the legalities of this. I've been thinking about this for a couple of months now, and I'm going to be honest, this might not even make it up because of copyright law. I have reached out to uh, Why Is This Happening and MSNBC for kind of a legal stamp off. I'm sure that's something they probably wouldn't do. Um, but I'm hoping under maybe the fair use I can eke this in. But leading up to this election, there is so much to unpack. Not even in the last like 4 or 8 years. There's so much to unpack in the last like basically 40 years of political history. And the reason that I say that primarily is for myself because I am now 47 years old and there's just a lot that I want to go into that I simply don't have the experience nor the time nor the vernacular to properly convey to people. So, what I'm looking to do leading up into the election is to create a series of videos where I let experts in the field talk via podcasts that aren't even my own. So, this is where it comes a little ambiguous when it comes to the legality of this and whether or not it'll work. A lot of these are from Chris Hayes' podcast. Why is this happening? There's some other ones like Strict Scrutiny, Amicus, and we're gonna. If this works, I will try to continue to do this on a regular basis. And I'm sorry, I know my voice seems crackly. I'm using a headset. All my streaming gear is packed away. It's disassembled. It's not even near me to the point where I can utilize it because with my job, the traveling that I do, and classes starting up again here in just a couple months, I don't have the time to devote to edit and to clean this up. So let's see if this works, and hopefully you guys get something out of it as well. All right.
Shortly after Trump was elected in 2016, and a piece actually came out in 2017 by Rick Perlstein in the New York Times Magazine. And it was basically kind of Rick saying that he had to revise his picture of the conservative movement, and cranks and oddballs and fringe figures that he had thought had been marginalized and pushed out of the conservative movement were more important than he had suspected. And also around this time, the alt-right, as it was known then, was really in the news a lot because they were very excited by Trump's victory, very excited by Trump's campaign. And I kept on coming across the name Murray Rothbard when reading the profiles and interviews with these guys. Now, a lot of these guys were neo-Nazis, but they all, almost to a man, talked about Murray Rothbard as the person who kind of started them on their road of to the kind of political consciousness that they had then. So I was looking around at what Rothbard wrote, and I found a piece from 1992 called Right-Wing Populism, a strategy for the paleo movement. And it was eerie what it said and how much it seemed to anticipate Trump and what had happened in the Republican Party.
Now, I'm going to stop right here and say that I realize that Trump is not the catalyst to this movement. We can go all the way back to the founding of the country, Manifest Destiny, slavery, all this stuff that kind of builds up to this point. But I think the point that they're making is that we are seeing a resurgence, unlike anything we've seen since the civil rights era. I'm going to go ahead and ignore Reagan's contribution to this now, but we will definitely come back to it later.
Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. We live in an era of the unprecedented. You hear that a lot. I get to say it a lot on the television show All In, which I host on MSNBC. And It's true. There's lots of stuff happening that hasn't happened before. At least since the firing of the cannons of Fort Sumter, there had been no violent attempt on the interruption of the transfer of power in the United States, not since Lincoln's election. So that really was pretty unprecedented, certainly in our lifetimes. There's never been a president impeached twice. That was unprecedented. There's never been a nominee for the presidency running who has 34 felony convictions. That's completely new in American history. It's been since the 19th century that we had someone running for president who had been president once before. There's a lot of stuff happening all the time that is genuinely new, has not happened before, out past the frontier of the known world. All of that said, of course, it is often tempting to dehistoricize the moment we're in, to view things as totally new and completely abrupt. And often you have opportunities to dip into some historical text. I've been doing this in this book I've been writing, where you will read something that feels shockingly contemporary, even from a long time ago. An article I was reading that was decrying the fact that everyone back in the 19th century was reading magazines, and the whole family never talked to each other anymore because each member of the family had their own magazine they were looking at. So you can find historical continuity, and oftentimes that historical continuity is as illuminating as our sense of disjuncture. And my guest today is someone who has found the source of historical continuity that has brought us to our current moment, I think in a fairly unlikely place, in a fascinating place, in the era politics of the kind of end of the Cold War 1990s. I think it's a time that, as we've gotten further from it, has been marked down in history as relatively placid. The emerging of this kind of global consensus about capitalism and democracy, and not the site of incredible contested violent conflict. You know, we think about the 60s as a tumultuous decade. We don't think about the 90s as a tumultuous decade in the same way. And yet it's certainly the case that many of the precursors to the ideological tendencies and cultural dispositions that would cohere into what we think of now as Trumpism or MAGA are extremely present in that decade. And John Gans is a fantastic writer. He writes a Substack that you should definitely check out. Someone who, I don't know anything about him. I know literally nothing about him. And I love this because it reminds me of the glory days of blogs, where you would find someone on the internet who wrote something really good and you'd think, Jesus, this is great. And then you keep reading them and you didn't know. Maybe they were a barista. Maybe they were an econ professor. Maybe they were a software engineer. Maybe they were a Hollywood producer doing this. You never knew. You had no idea what their credentials were or where they were. They were just writing really good stuff, and you're reading it. John Gans is one of these people who I started reading, and this book is phenomenal. The book is called When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. John, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me, Chris.
I saw a picture of you, I think, for the first time fairly recently. I was like, I don't know, the guy, he could be 65 years old for all I know, or he could be 15. He could be a high school freshman savant who spends all his time reading history. So
somewhere in between. Congratulations on the book. It's genuinely excellent. Thanks so much.
Truly, truly great. How did you? Well, first, tell me a little bit about yourself. Like,
sure.
Why am I reading a John Gans history? Where does all your erudition come from?
Well, I have a history degree with honors from the University of Michigan, which served me very well. I've always been extremely interested in history, political theory, social theory, and these, were a big part of my reading habits. And I wrote before the election of 2016 a little bit, mostly about art and culture, not very much about politics, although I was always interested in politics. But then I thought I had to take politics more seriously and started to write more about politics.
How did you find your way to the 1990s and the topic of this book?
Yeah. So basically what happened was all these events kind of fade together in my memory now, but I'll try to reconstruct it. So shortly after Trump was elected in 2016, a piece actually came out in 2017 by Rick Perlstein in the New York Times Magazine. And it was basically kind of Rick saying that he had to revise his picture of the conservative movement and cranks and oddballs and fringe figures that he had thought had been marginalized and pushed out of the conservative movement were more important than he had suspected. And also around this time, the alt-right, as it was known then, was really in the news a lot because they were very excited by Trump's victory, very excited by Trump's campaign. And I kept on coming across the name Murray Rothbard when reading the profiles and interviews with these guys. Now, a lot of these guys were neo-Nazis, but they all, almost to a man, talked about Murray Rothbard as the person who kind of started them on their road of to the kind of political consciousness that they had then. So I was looking around at what Rothbard wrote, and I found a piece from 1992 called Right-Wing Populism, a strategy for the paleo movement. And it was eerie what it said and how much it seemed to anticipate Trump and what had happened in the Republican Party. So I had this essay or this article from his newsletter, and then I tried to get in touch with writers who I admired. I wasn't known as a writer very much. I had written a couple things, but nothing big. And I tried to send this to Jamel Bowie, who didn't know me at the time, but now we're friends. And I tried to send this to Rick Perlstein, same story. And, they didn't get back to me. So I had to start writing about this myself, essentially, which turned out to be a good thing. So I wrote a piece about Murray Rothbard for the Baffler. And then shortly, a few months after that, I think, I wrote a piece about the year 1992 in general, and put Rothbard kind of into context of David Duke's run for governor in Louisiana and Pat Buchanan's primary campaign against George H.W. Bush, Ross Perot's candidacy, and a bunch of other strange things that were going on at that time.
The book sort of chronologically starts with Duke, but maybe let's start with Rothbard because he is a fascinating figure.
Sure.
Son of the Bronx, like myself.
Yeah.
Who is Murray Rothbard?
Murray Rothbard is one of the big figures in American libertarianism. He is one of the people who helped found the Cato Institute, but he was kind of also a marginalized and fringe figure. He was involved with the right in the 1950s.
So I'm going to say this real quick. If you're not familiar with the Cato Institute, what I suggest is that you actually stop listening to this right now and don't even go to the website. Like, go to like the Wikia page, right? And go to some of the cited references and just read up on the Cato Institute. You piss yourself.
Emergence of the conservative movement, but was pushed out because of his extreme libertarianism and his continued adherence to the pre-war tradition of isolationism, which was not what the conservative movement with its Cold War hawkishness really wanted to have anything to do with. So he led a literally very eccentric life in American politics. In the 1960s, he tried to kind of forge a coalition alliance with the New Left because he thought he shared some of their critiques of the welfare warfare state, bureaucracy. That did not work out. That's when, after that episode, and he getting tired of the New Left getting tired of him, he moved over to, Meet the Kochs and try to start Cato. He was pushed out of that organization, partially for his personal difficulties, partially for his extremism. He's involved in trying to, machinations within the Libertarian Party to push it in his direction. And eventually he comes up with a kind of new synthesis that he calls paleo-libertarianism with a man named Lew Rockwell, who had been Ron Paul's chief aide. So this is kind of the Ron Paul side of the libertarian movement. And this includes an extreme free market, laissez-faire capitalist approach with very strong social conservatism, and which is not something he was very much opposed to what he called left libertarianism with their kind of hippie-ish social liberalism.
Pod and do whatever you want in the bedroom and abortion and things like that.
Yeah, he managed to still call himself a libertarian, but was really also a pretty vociferous social conservative. But what he comes up with after he witnesses David Duke's run is he comes up with this strategy, this theory of politics, which he had been kind of working on for a very long time. There's a few components to it. He was sort of a victim insofar as they actually happened. He was a bit of a victim of Buckley's famed purges from the conservative movement. So he viewed those as a kind of betrayal and weakening of the conservative movement. He viewed himself as the continuer of the pre-war America First isolationist right. So he thought, okay, well, our moment has arrived where the Buckleyites' ascendancy and control over conservatism and the right in America is coming to an end, and we're returning to an older, healthier tradition that I'm a representative of. But he also says, and when he writes right-wing populism, he says, look, let's face it, we live in a big statist world. The government is in close cahoots with big corporations. They have these kind of underclass parasitical clients, and together they squeeze and exploit the middle class in the country. So
I'm also going to pause right here to kind of fray out, if I can, how do I say this? The ideas from the ideology. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this or not, but one of the reasons that the alt-right Nazism, just discrimination in general, bigotry, gains a lot of followers and keeps them and has this constant resurgence in history is one of the reasons is that the ideologies that they hold, like what he just said, where the government is in cahoots with big business. This is pretty much all governments across the world now, not as extreme as America is, but a lot of policy is directly shaped by the interests of corporations, and especially in America, because corporations now have the ability to spend as much money as they want and simply buy politicians. Now, when these ideas, like that is fact, that is objective fact. That's not me being a libertarian. That's not me being a conservative. That's not me being a liberal. That is just simply fact, and you can look this up on any given day in the American news cycle and see examples of it. The reason that people then kind of, I don't know, sway to these more extreme ideologies is because these ideologies take these ideas that are in fact truthful and use false equivalencies and straw man theories to draw false references and connections between those truths and their extremist ideology. And so if you ever wonder like how, when you look back and you think like 1938, how could like normal everyday Germans allow for a Nazi party to be voted in and all this. Again, they won only like I think it was like 34%. They were a minority party that became rapidly militaristic. Again, Project 2025, what we're seeing right now. So know that it is always multifaceted regardless. So when I kind of boil down and be reductionist in terms of like, oh well, this is just Nazism, extremism, authoritarianism, these are umbrella terms that underneath them have all these subcategories that kind of people cling on to. They may cling on to one, they may cling on to several, and if anything that they say is somehow objectively true, they make the false equivalency then that the ideology that they cling to is also true. And that's what you're going to see a lot when you come into contact with bigots and extremists, is that they will make these false equivalencies by cherry picking objective truths and falsely attributing it to Nazism, authoritarianism, whatever it is. So I just kind of wanted to like parse that out before we go forward on this, because you're going to hear a lot of it, and it's going to be repeated time and time again because it is a very effective tool.
Strategy is not to dismantle the state so much, although that may have remained, it definitely remained his ultimate goal, but to put in a kind of big bully in the White House and to menace and smash the liberal elites that he hated. And the inspiration for this, partly, and he had been working on this theory since the 1950s, was Joe McCarthy. And Joe McCarthy, I think a lot of conservatives who attempted to make themselves appear respectable to liberal elites.
Sorry, cutting in again. If you probably heard the term McCarthyism a lot in the news media, and this is what they're referring to. Again, if you don't know who Joe McCarthy is and his influence on politics today, it's very dense. Again, I suggest going to the wiki page and kind of, finding out certain things about him, then going to the references that you want to learn more about and read them. Don't just read the wiki page. I'm not advocating for that.
Would defend aspects of the Red Scare, defend a muscular approach to the Soviet Union, but say, okay, maybe McCarthy was a bit crude and a bit of a demagogue. And Rothbard essentially says, no, you've got it exactly wrong. McCarthy's demagogy and his ability to menace the liberal elites is exactly what was good about him. And this is what we should emulate.
So there's a few strains here, right? There's the sort of, maybe somewhat paradoxically for a libertarian, he really likes the strong executive. He sees the presidency as a great place to sort of like wield this kind of power. Caesarism, I think, in the words of Samuel Francis, is another thinker that we'll get to.
Yeah.
There's this kind of populism. It's driven by this resentment that goes both up and down. There's the resentment against big business and the sort of globalist elites, both the country club and the sort of Fortune 500 CEO types, and then the quote underclass, the clients, predominantly black and brown folks, immigrants, black people in major urban centers, particularly. This kind of white middle class and its resentments both up and down. And this a kind of embrace of demagoguery. And also this sort of, on the kind of isolationist front, this kind of rejection of some of the interventionism of the Cold War era conservative movement, right? Like those are some of the big strains that he's marrying together there.
Yes.
So that's Rothbard. Now, this vision is, I mean, he's just a weird intellectual who sort of bops around. But you note his sort of eureka moment is watching David Duke's success.
Yeah.
And Duke is sort of the person that puts this into practice before Buchanan and to a certain extent Perot. And we could talk about that. But talk about Duke's political success and what it did to the Republican Party and conservative movement at the time, and what ideas it gave to some of them.
Well, I think basically the most interesting thing about David Duke, as a parallel to what we've seen the past few years, I mean, David Duke was a neo-Nazi and a former Grand Wizard of the Klan. He kind of disavowed this, but not really. It was pretty thin. And he goes on to become a state legislator in Louisiana. And then he goes on to run for Senate. And then he goes on to run for governor against the state and national parties. And the state and national parties were unable to stop him. And they were really frantic in ways that kind of reminded me of the Republicans in 2016, really unable to stop Trump. Now, ultimately, Duke, freighted with his past and, a certain lack of political talent, perhaps, falls. I mean, there's a very big black vote in Louisiana. They're not about to, elect a former Klansman. So he loses, but he wins 55% of the white vote. And I think most notably, again, really gives the Republican establishment a lot of trouble. And yes, Rothbard, Sam Francis, another one of these paleo-conservative intellectuals, and Pat Buchanan all see the David Duke candidacy and the struggle that the mainstream Republicans, RNC, I mean, George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan both released radio ads against him. They sent the RNC staffers to fight against him when he was just running for a state legislator seat. They were spooked by him. And this was a hopeful sign to this little group circle of paleo conservatives. And they took this as a signal for the launching of their own political ambitions at the time.
You do a great job chronicling Duke and both his sort of vileness, but also his appeal. And one of the things the Republicans and even the local media keep encountering, there are two aspects that really resonate. One is that he's an attentional magnet. He loves being on TV. He makes good TV, so people keep having him on TV. He's constantly sort of the star of the story. He's a good story. He's good copy, right?
Yeah.
Former Grand Wizard runs for office. And the second thing is, nothing seemed to once people kind of locked into him, once a certain kind of white person in Louisiana locked into him, often not people who, a lot of whom were conservatives, but other people who were a little more politically unaffiliated, it was very difficult to pry them loose with like facts about what a disgusting monster he was.
Yeah.
It just didn't work. And they kept finding themselves flummoxed by this.
Yeah, it was a very strange phenomenon, and there's a clear parallel. I mean, when I was researching the book, there was a focus group run by the the choice of the mainstream party, the incumbent governor Buddy Roemer, and they asked people, well, what about a guy who got in a facelift, and what about a guy who had hadn't paid taxes or never really had a real job, and they hated this hypothetical candidate. But when they were told it was David Duke, they made up a lot of excuses. They said, well, only stupid people pay taxes. He must be smart, which sounds very familiar. So, yeah, there was a certain magnetism he had for voters, and it was intensified when he came under attack by the establishment and the media. It was intensified. Now, it's important to note that this did not make him invincible. It just created a certain base, a certain core that was very loyal to him and very hard to shake. Ultimately, he loses quite badly. It was a landslide election against him. But more sophisticated political observers, like the people who wanted to emulate him, really took very careful note of that white vote.
That he's able to win the majority of the white vote.
Yes. Yeah.
He actually, there's a crazy moment where he comes to the Senate gallery now this is after he's lost. So he wins the state rep seat, which is a nail biter. He wins by 226 votes or something like that. He runs for state rep. He runs for Senate. He loses. He runs for governor. He loses. But he ends up in the Senate gallery during like a civil rights bill debate, sort of attempting to kind of personally intimidate George H.W. Bush into not voting or not signing a piece of civil rights legislation that is passed by both houses.
Yeah. So this bill, which had broad bipartisan support, the Civil Rights Act of 1992, which you don't hear talked about that much, was opposed by, the hard right and some business interests. Duke goes to the Senate gallery while they are trying to overturn Bush's veto of this bill. And it comes close, but doesn't work. Duke goes outside and crows to the news cameras that he's the reason why Bush vetoed the bill, because he could see that the kind of appeal that he was having was politically potent. He didn't want to irritate this section of the electorate. And then he goes and gives an interview at the Washington Times. And there he meets with Sam Francis, who you've mentioned earlier, who's very intrigued by what Duke has to say. Did Duke actually affect that vote or affect Bush's decision to veto it? He certainly was not the only person on the right who did not like the Civil Rights Act of 1992, but he was a very visible exponent of resistance to it. It's really interesting to think back about the Civil Rights Act of 1992, which again is a little bit obscure now, because at the time it was called it was labeled a quota bill. There had been a series of Supreme Court cases that had weakened employee protections for race discrimination, sexual harassment. And this was a legislative fix for those problems. Now, if you read some of the more sophisticated attacks on wokeness today and DEI and so on and so forth that actually try to connect it to the civil rights infrastructure of the government, they will bring up the Civil Rights Act of 1992, continuing this tradition, I guess you could call it, of opposition to it. But, unless you're an employment lawyer, you're not going to hear very much about it.
One of the lessons about Duke that I would say Rothbard and then Francis, who we'll talk about, and then Buchanan, who's really the big one. And there's two lessons. One is race baiting is very powerful. Racism is powerful. It's a powerful way to attract white voters. And the idea that there are certain things that just can't be done or said, and certain kinds of backgrounds that couldn't possibly support a politician aren't really true. Maybe the boundaries are different than you think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's a complicated issue. I think that it's obviously polarizing, as people might say today. I think that there are both in the type of politics that say someone like David Duke practices, there are strengths and obvious weaknesses, right? So he can get a very enthusiastic core of support, but at the same time, alienates a lot of other people,
Yes.
frightens and mobilizes them. So it's a little bit of a game of chicken, a little bit. How scary can you possibly be that will excite your type of voters, but it won't scare people too much that they'll be encouraged to really come and bash you at the polls, right? So David Duke obviously is a little bit too, being a literal Nazi, a little bit too frightening,
Also humorless, which I think is key.
He was somewhat humorless for sure. I mean, he actually, people found him charming.
He had his own appeal.
Yeah, he's not as okay.
The Trump humor shtick to me is a key way that Trump pulls off this trade at a higher mathematical level.
Absolutely.
Than Duke was able to. Is the kind of like weird, is he playing a character tongue-in-cheekness all the time that gives everybody a kind of plausible deniability about just how bad he can be, and allows people to go there in a way that was harder with a literal Nazi, in the person of Duke or even Buchanan.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I also think that what I've mentioned recently, and I don't think is really mentioned enough with Trump, is that Trump has an organic, these guys are, look, David Duke wanted to be Adolf Hitler, but he wasn't, he's not. Right. And, he didn't have that kind of talent or relationship with crowds. Trump has a relationship with crowds that's very unusual in American American politicians are real pros. I think they would go to countries in Europe and clean up,
Yep.
But I think Trump is different. He doesn't shape a message with his advisors, or maybe he does that a little bit, but he kind of does this on the fly. He has an organic relationship with the crowds. He sees what they want to hear. They respond to him leading them, but they know that he's also taking cues from them. And this relationship, this dynamic is quite unique, and it explains a lot of his loyalty and a lot of the excitement he generates in people. Not any of the candidates, maybe a little bit. Ross Perot had a little bit of this, but most of the candidates I discuss in my book are more conventional.
More of our conversation after this quick break.
I'm Dan Taberski. In 2011,
something's wrong here. Something's not right.
Best backyard barbecue. Today. You can do this when you Angie that.
I'm going to try to skip past commercials. It's kind of hard sometimes.
So we talked about Rothbard, we talked about Duke. Duke goes and meets with Francis, who's another key figure here. Mm-hmm. Francis is at the right-wing Washington Times at the time, as editorial page writer. And Francis is, again, he calls himself a fascist, pronounced fascist in the Italian style.
Right.
And along the lines of Rothbard, kind of authoritarian racist populism, essentially.
Yeah. Well, basically his hope. So Sam Francis becomes involved with the conservative movement around the time of the New Right, what's called the New Right. And the New Right is part of the kind of single issue movements having to do with busing, gun control, abortion, taxes. And they are all kind of separate, but they sort of come together and coalesce in part of the wave that gets Reagan into the White House. But they are kind of not so intellectually coherent. So Francis is asked to contribute an essay for a book that's trying to give the New Right kind of a theoretical underpinning. And he says, this represents the revolt of middle Americans, the rise of middle Americans as a kind of ascendant class. And the Reagan administration is this Caesarist populist presidency that will, forge a new political order that's in the interest of these middle American radicals. He got this idea from a sociologist named Don Warren. He, and like many of his other people on the hard right, and he says very notably in this, we can't really call ourselves conservatives anymore. We really have to call ourselves something else. We're radical. We're revolutionary. We're radical. Right. We're not conserving things anymore. The old institutions are dead. He, over the course of the 80s, like many other people on the hard right, some of whom he's quite close with, are very disappointed with the Reagan administration. Now, to us liberals and leftists, we think of the Reagan administration as a huge success for the right and a big disaster for the left. But for people on the hard right, Reagan was a moderate and a squish.
I mean, there are certain ideological dispositions that can only be disappointed. So
yes,
so
and you know
that's
what?
part
That's
of that
also
too.
very true. Yeah, that's also very true. And I think Reagan is also temperamentally a lot different from the right in a lot of ways, with his sunniness and his optimism. So by the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, Francis is very unhappy with the state of the Republican Party, and like Rothbard, like Buchanan, who he has a personal relationship with, he sees the arrival of Duke as being a sign that maybe something else is up. What's also interesting to think about is, I know there's a lot of emphasis in studies on the right put on evangelicals and on the Christian right, and I don't think that that's wrong, but I will note that in '88, Pat Robertson tried to primary Bush, and that did not activate this button that made all of these members of the populist hard right kind of say, oh, maybe it's time to go, in the way that David Duke did.
So Francis and Buchanan are meeting.
Yes,
they're having.
I'm going to go ahead and chime in here for a second. For those who are not as old as I am, who were not alive during the Reagan administration or have studied it at all, Ronald Reagan was I would say the originator of the idea of make America great again. That's I don't know if he was the first politician to ever say it, but it was a main point of his campaign. And to give some context to this is that I wonder if I can find a podcast on this that'll go deeper into it. But Reagan, at the time, while he was seen as a moderate to radicals, to the rest of the Republican Party at that time, Reagan was very much a evangelical extremist. Apparently I missed my portal up here. He spoke in the dog whistling code words to evangelicals in the southern state, basically utilizing the southern strategy to get elected. He, demonized pretty much all government as being the problem, being bad. You can see this in his massive deregulation of the transportation industry and several other industry codes. And he cut taxes by, I don't even know, it's like some ridiculous amount. But in the course of his 8 years, he had to raise taxes 8 times because he was plummeting America into more and more debt. And this is where he is kind of the beginning of this swing where we see that Republicans talk about fiscal responsibility but end up blowing up the debt. Only then, when the pendulum swings to Democrats, they end up fixing it and go back and forth. Republicans blow it up, then go back to, at least in the last 40 years context, this keeps happening. So that's just a little context into why. I'm not sure how much they're going to go down the Reagan hole, but I just wanted to give a little bit there before we go on.
Buchanan then, I think, kind of takes some of the ideas of Francis and the ideas of Duke, and he puts it into that 92 campaign. And people have drawn these parallels before. I mean, that campaign really is a paleo campaign. It has these kind of recognizable features in that it is kind of trade skeptical, even anti-trade, also very anti-immigrant, also very demagogic, bullying, sort of authoritarian in its kind of tone, if that makes sense,
Yeah.
And it's surprisingly successful again. And Buchanan's a smart guy. I knew him a little bit back in the day when on MSNBC with him. And he's pretty intentional about what he's doing. He both believes it, but also understands what he's doing, right?
He's a political professional and a media professional.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's his theory of the case for that race?
I think he believes that David Duke's, unexpected strength, the weakness of the Republican establishment is a kind of go signal, but he also has his own grievances, one of which is that he believes, along with his fellows, that the neoconservatives have become too powerful within the conservative movement in the Republican Party. and they need to be kind of thrown out. So his campaign, as much as an attack on H.W. Bush, who is not really a neoconservative. He had neoconservative allies and advisors, but is really like, I think in their mind, although H.W. Bush kind of moved pretty far to the right, was a Rockefeller establishment Republican kind of guy who they got to get rid of.
He was mostly just a guy who happened to be there.
In my opinion, yes. I think he was a professional public servant whose ambition was to rise to the highest office he possibly could. I think he was driven by a very old type of patriotism, WASP type of patriotism that
and
is
ego,
different.
like everyone.
And ego, yeah.
Yeah.
Which was different from the nationalism that was espoused by somebody like Buchanan.
I mean, he's the least populist person you can imagine.
Yeah, he's a preppy wasp, like Kenny Bunkport and so on and so forth. So he views his campaign as also a war against the neocons, an attempt to reverse their power within the party or to arrest their power within the party. So that's part of his crusade, is to take back our, as he puts it, to take back our party and then our country. Now, the thing to note about the neoconservatives and Buchanan is Buchanan, there's really no way around it. He's an anti-Semite. He throughout his career, he's evinced anti-Semitic opinions. He seems to have gotten that from his family when he was growing up.
I mean, he wrote a book basically saying, more or less, we picked the wrong side in World War II.
Right. And that's, he's a part of he views himself also as part of this a member of this America First tradition.
Yeah. So going back to Taft and Lindbergh and all those folks who were very skeptical of the American war machine and also were, if not pro-Nazi, kind of, not sympathetic and not that upset about them, and often quite anti-globalist, which also always is difficult to disentangle from opposition to the nefarious actions of the international Jew.
Exactly. So he, views the neocons many of them are Jewish, and he resents their, like with his other guys on the paleocon right, resents their kind of importation of liberal ideas into the right. Now, Buchanan's version of conservatism, although it does undergo some changes in the 1980s. He says at one point, I think in 1989, to Sid Blumenthal, the biggest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. So this is the space he sought to occupy. So he familiarized himself with the language. I mean, he knew this, being a man of the right, but he definitely familiarized himself and began to speak the language of the far right increasingly. The other thing is, though, he is a veteran of two White Houses. The Reagan White House, where he was communications director, and he was an advisor also to Nixon. And this may not be well known among liberals and lefties today, but Nixon was not particularly well liked within the conservative movement. He was viewed as an establishment Republican, a pragmatist, a liberal.
Yeah,
Buchanan was close to him and had a different view.
Now, for those, I'm going to die here. For those who don't know, and who may hear that statement about Nixon and be like, what are you talking about? So a lot of people forget that the EPA and OSHA, along with several other governing regulatory bodies, were created by Nixon. Nixon, for his delusions and paranoia and wanting to be king, much like a lot of presidents, he was more liberal. And this is a point that I want to make when it comes to, they are getting into this a little bit. I'm not sure how far they're going to get into it. So the detriment of Reagan to the Conservative Party, which they're alluding to at least, is that before Reagan, you had Carter, Ford, Nixon, Eisenhower. Within the GOP, there was a spectrum of Republicans. You had center Republicans, you had liberal Republicans, you had conservative Republicans, and then you had the fringe sort of just flat out racists who think that the Civil War should never been fought and slavery should still be utilized today. When there's other people leading up to and help Reagan get elected, but that's really, Reagan is the inflection point when that spectrum of Republicans in the GOP starts to dissipate. The moderates and the liberals within the Republican Party start to leave, and they become, more independents. Some actually go over to the Democratic Party and all that. And I don't want to harp on this too much because I'm sure I'll talk about this in another episode if this experiment actually works out. But when people keep referring back to Reaganism as kind of the start, that's what they're talking about. It's not the start of racism. It's not the start of, ideological authoritarianism in America, but it is. He is an inflection point within the GOP since the civil rights movement. Meaning that, with oh God, I'm blanking on his name right now. Wallace, segregation today, segregation next week, segregation forever, that sort of thing. That's what they usually mean. And so I just wanted to give a little context in there and explain why it's not just Reagan himself, but the GOP, that's when it really started to morph and purge itself of anyone not aligned with purely evangelical Christian values. And thus, this just gets harder and harder and harder to the right. You see it, even with Bush, as they said, like Bush was more of an institutionalist. He wasn't very popular. You see Clinton get elected, and then they go to, W. Bush, who, again, is more of a populist, more of a like, well, yeah, I may be rich and famous, and I may have been born with a silver spoon, but I'm an evangelical, and I believe that, we should have a faith wing and all this stuff, and, maybe we should ban abortion. And then after him, you get something that I never thought possible in my lifetime. We get our first black president. Now, because that is such a huge inflection point, and it was such a win for the idea of egalitarian liberal democracy, it, in hindsight, it almost seems natural for the fringe right, who lost their collective fucking minds over Obama, to then elect basically someone who has come out and said he wants to be an authoritarian, right? Which is Trump. And I think that collective screaming that we saw with Obama, and I mean, literally they lost their minds. I mean, Hannity went on for months about Obama wearing a tan suit. Like, that is how deep this white grievance resentment is towards any non-white male being in a position of power. And while I will say that, like, I do believe that Kamala Harris will be our next president, there is going to be an even stronger and more violent reaction to that going forward. And it's not because I'm a doomsayer or something. It's that this is what history has taught us time and time again. And the fact that people are like in denial of this is just shocking to me, and one of the reasons that I want to try to create this series. So sorry, a little bit of a rant there. Let's go ahead and go back to the podcast.
And had a very interesting reading of Watergate. Basically, he thought that Nixon was this tribune of middle American populism, that Watergate was essentially an establishment elite liberal coup against Nixon. And the missed opportunity of Watergate was not to launch a kind of counter coup. So that just kind of tells you the tone in which Buchanan is reading politics. He has a personal crusade, in a sense, to retake the conservative movement and also to, retake the country.
So to me, the sort of defining features of that 92 race, there's sort of tonal and rhetorical ones, and then there's substantive ones. The tonal and rhetorical ones are this just really braying and kind of bile-filled populism. I mean, you know, that speech at the convention is just this, sort of execrable. It's the one someone famously quipped, I like it in the original German. And it ends on this totally kind of fascistic ending about the LA riots and the soldiers
Yeah.
The sort of that everything comes from the soldier, that's the true source of all sort of freedom, and
Yeah.
and this who's who list of all the enemies, the feminists and the
Yeah.
so there's that. There's just the bigotry and the demagoguery and this sort of populace, this sort of resentment that just drips through everything. Everything is resentment.
Yeah.
And then there's these kind of substantive areas, three of which I think really do become, that are really important because they do become, I think, they form the basis of what will be successful in 2016, which is anti-immigrant, anti-trade, anti-foreign intervention.
Yeah.
And those are the places where there's real heterodoxy, real breaks with some of the establishment ideologically, and are actual substantive, not just tonal changes. And all three of those are going to be woven back together, 24 years later.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Buchanan is on campaign in New Hampshire, and he's already a part of this kind of protectionist wing of the right. And he plans to run against, he thought what conservatives and Republicans would be upset about was the breaking of the no new taxes pledge, right? So Bush makes the famous no new taxes pledge and he breaks it. And among right wingers today, the story that they tell, or more conventional conservatives, the story they tell themselves is that's why Bush lost the election. But what Buchanan discovers in New Hampshire campaigning is that people are much more concerned about trade. So that becomes a more central part of his message. He doesn't talk about the no new taxes stuff very much. So the trade stuff becomes big. People are very concerned about, what the last decade of free trade policies and then upcoming, the negotiations are going on for NAFTA and what the effects of that will be. And, at the time, New Hampshire is in an economic downturn because of the recession of 1990-91. So yes, then the interesting thing is, although the Gulf War was extremely popular, Buchanan, Rothbard, and Francis all opposed it, mostly for pacifist reasons, but because of the multilateral nature of it and the globalist side of it, that it was, America's sovereignty was threatened by these multilateral agreements.
It's funny you say that because one of the things that would happen that I remember from my early 20s post 9/11 is when, opposition to particularly the war in Afghanistan, but then the war in Iraq was a, relatively marginal view, not totally marginal, but you go to anti-war events or anti-war, these folks were sort of floating at the edges of it because they were the people on the right that were also kind of anti-war. But then you would always, there'd be like some table at the event that like some weird libertarians had.
Sure.
and you look at the table and it had like, you'd be like, that was interesting. It was like the Ron Paul people, basically. And, and they'd have a Samuel Francis book and then there'd be a Rothbard. Then there's like, there's something about the Zionists where you're like,
yeah.
And then there's a book about how like Abraham Lincoln was a dictator.
Yeah.
And like suspended habeas corpus. And you'd be like, okay, all right. I got what's going on at this table. This is going. I understand this table. But that was a real fixture of certain kind of anti-war events back in the early aughts.
I remember that. I remember that very clearly, Chris. I remember seeing that kind of literature where it's like mixture of kind of anti-Clinton. I mean, this is after Clinton is president, but there's still anti-Clinton paranoia. Yeah. And then you see like more kind of abstractly trilateral commission.
Yes, right.
So I'm just going to harp on this a little bit more. So this actually relates to my first rant that I was talking about, that these sort of, we can not even claim them as Nazism. You can say authoritarianism, fascism, policies rooted in bigotry and power and whatnot. This is what I'm talking about, is that they'll take these little truths, they'll cherry pick objective ideas and falsely attribute them that the only way that they're successful is via authoritarianism, fascism, Nazism, whatever, right? And you're going to see this constantly over and over again. Like, this is kind of what Fox News talking heads have become proficient at. So when you look at the talking heads or the news anchors on Fox News, which I do from occasionally because apparently I hate myself, they will go on these gish gallops, basically making these false points of, like, this is because of this is because of this happens because of this. They don't give you any sort of more in-depth analysis. They don't present solutions to it. They just It's all about identifying problems and blaming someone. That's kind of their entire shtick of the last pretty much 20 years since Fox News really became, kind of a centerpiece with Rumsfeld after 9/11. The Gish Gallop has kind of been more and more present um, across the Fox News political spectrum, and that's why we have like OAN and Newsmax and the rise of those along with Trump. So just know that you can see this happen. Don't take my word for it. Like if you really want to see it, just any Fox News show, just really listen to what they're saying because it's not much.
Exactly. Yes.
Bankers, and you're like,
Or the Rothschild, the Rothschild family, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I'm sure that if you asked the guy for the real stuff, he would reach under the table. And,
yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So they all oppose the war, which again is a real thing. I mean, it makes them unpopular in their own party. That war, of course, is very popular. But then what's interesting is that in some ways, Buchanan. It's so fascinating to me. Buchanan and Perot are different ideological figures. They're coded at the time very differently. It doesn't feel like at the time, having lived through it at the age of 13 and as a news junkie, even at that tender age, like a lot of continuity. But you draw out some of the continuity and really there's a lot there that places them in conversation with each other.
Well, they were both concerned about trade. Perot had also been a skeptic of the intervention in the Gulf. They both kind of were worshipers of the 1950s. I think that at the time, most commentators thought that they were, part of the same kind of underlying phenomenon. Buchanan, when his campaign is flagging, he says, look, I can't really compete with Ross Perot. Most of the people who are interested in me are now going after him because he looks like the winner. So, yes, I mean, look, race is less front and center part of Perot's appeal, and it's much more on the surface level, kind of universalistic. The fact of the matter is that Perot's appeal was mostly white.
Right.
He had trouble breaking into minority constituencies, not helped by his extreme awkwardness around race, because, he was from Texas and he had very condescending and paternalistic attitudes about black people. Not as hateful, perhaps, as Buchanan, but did not help him. He gave a disastrous speech at the NAACP. There's a folksiness to Perot that is a lot less threatening than Buchanan, and I think he's angry, but it's a different tone to the anger, and it turns less people off than Buchanan or definitely David Duke.
We'll be right back after we take this quick break.
Hi, I'm Angie Hicks, co-founder of Angie. When you use Angie for your home project, you know all your jobs.
Shopify powers 10% of all
There was a sense at the time that something had changed, had happened, that this was historically important, maybe even a hinge point. And it's interesting now how much that just seems like a footnote. Like, what was the meaning of Ross Perot? No one really even asked that question. It was just like, well, that was kind of a quirky thing we did there. But you read it as something that did signal something deeper.
I think it signaled a true vein of discontent with the political establishment, looking for some way to express itself. It was the biggest challenge to the two-party system since Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party, which is almost 100 years earlier. And I think it represented, a vein of anger and disconnect at the government, with sometimes extremely vague notions of what that meant. But it seemed to peter out. The party establishment seemed to be victorious. But then I think, one interpretation of Trump that makes a lot of sense to me was essentially that Trump is a third party candidate who's kind of taken over one of the major parties, right? He's agglomerated himself. And, when he was kind of playing around with the idea of running for president in the past, Ross Perot's Reform Party was once, one of the vehicles he was looking at. So he definitely viewed that world of third parties, of protest votes as a possible angle. And ultimately, he attaches himself to the Tea Party, which is an internal anti-establishment faction of the Republican Party. So I think basically Trump represents the triumph. I mean, I think of Trump as a synth.
So I have to stop this here for a quick moment. For those who don't remember, Ted Cruz, I think, being the most prominent. The Tea Party in American politics, and this is what I'm talking about, the day after Obama was inaugurated, I believe. Oh shit, I'm gonna like double. I think it was the day after. Was it inauguration or elected? I can't remember now. But it was one of those 2 days, like either the day after Obama was elected or that he was inaugurated. Ted Cruz and some other people create the Tea Party, and it is 100% based on this idea of white grievance and white power. And I mean, Ted Cruz is just the pustulous ass sore on American politics who doesn't even engage in the political system. He just basically is, trading stocks and doing his podcast as much as possible and being contrarian and keeps his speeches very rhetorical. But this is what I mean about like the Tea Party. People kind of forget about it now because it's been overwhelmed by Trumpism. Is that, again, this is just another inflection point due to our political system engaging with the mass populace and a black president being voted in. So you're going to see this over and over again. But I just wanted to kind of state, like, this is not something that it's never been gone, but it was never as prevalent as the sort of inflection points they're talking about. One being Reagan, and then the next one, I think, really being the election of Obama. So anyway, let's go on.
And I think the book tries to articulate the different elements that would go on to be crystallized within Trump. And one of them is Ross Perot's third party, clean up government, drain the swamp, throw the rascals out, middle class populism. Some of it is it's Buchanan and David Duke's kind of ethno-nationalist, race baity, anti-immigrant stuff. And then some of it is the entertainment industry. Trump is, a creature of cable news. I mean, as is Perot and as is Buchanan to a great degree. But so I think that, obviously he's not a repetition exactly of Perot, but Perot shows that there's a large opening for someone to attack the political establishment as such, from a vantage point that is sometimes an attack from the left and sometimes an attack from the right.
I think there's always this search for kind of materialist causal explanations.
Yeah.
Particularly on the left. And I certainly do this as well. And I have my own theories. And I wrote a book back in 2012 that had something of a materialist, or at least a sort of macroeconomic account of some of the levels of distrust and elite failure and sort of the kind of breakdown of meritocracy as a means of explaining some of this alienation that I think has culminated in things like Brexit and Trump. But I also think there's limitations that I wonder, like, what was it about this time in 20s? Is there anything, or is it just that history is a kind of stochastic process? But was there something specific about 92 and 2016 that marked it as propitious moments for this, for the first sort of forays of this style of politics in Duke, Buchanan, and then Perot, and then for Trump's success in 2016?
Yeah, I think my orientation is similar. I try to base this in kind of a material account. I think it does have limitations. There are other things going on, but essentially what you see in 1992 is that the way that the economy was re-geared during the Reagan 80s, some of the consequences that are becoming apparent for the first time. And you have the American middle class really struggling. A lot of people are falling through the cracks. Wages have stagnated now for about a decade. Unions have been crushed. Interest rate, this is different from now and the last 20 years or so, or 15 years. But interest rates were very high, which also encouraged, contributed to wage stagnation. And you have also a great deal of discontent with the political establishment because there's a sense that the political elite, the political class, is just working in their own interest and in the interest of lobbies and special interests to kind of make these deals that just divide up the spoils of the government, and there's not a sense of a broader public spiritedness going on. So there's a great deal of anger. There is not, I would say, it's not right to exactly understand this as a class struggle, although that's the underlying problem. But the issue is what you see in this period is that there is a struggle essentially between the represented and the representatives. There's a lot of irritation, anger by people against Congress, against representative government in general. And Kevin Phillips, the famous Republican strategist and Nixon advisor, sees, he identifies this as a rejection of representative government as such, searching around for a plebiscitary form of government, a strong man, an authoritarian leader who can cut through the morass of special interests and kind of, rule on behalf of the people.
So Kevin Phillips identifying this desire for this kind of, sort of populist strong man who can cut out all the special interests who are preying on the aggrieved white middle class, right, both from below and above. And that's a similar thing that Samuel Francis identifies. And there's a deeper ideological thing happening here. I mean, Francis calls himself a fascist. Mm-hmm. Buchanan doesn't, but I think has some sympathies that go in that direction. Sure. And the ideological moment we find ourselves in is a kind of rejection, a deep rejection of liberal democracy and its ethos. And there's a part of the book where this synthesis and this alternative ideological vision is made plain in this essay that Francis writes about The Godfather. Right. And I thought this was the most ideologically revelatory part of the book. You just wrote about it in your Substack, Unpopular Front, because it kind of perfectly captures the Trumpist model, like what Trump truly believes about, to the extent he has normative political commitments about how things should be, that they are embodied in this sort of mafia state vision with him as the Don. Mm-hmm. And this is something that people at, the Don Father and all these things, these sort of mafia terms, he talks about snitches and all this stuff. So this has always been there. But Francis basically writing an ideological endorsement of this really blew me away. Tell me about that essay.
That essay he writes, in 1992 is called The Godfather is a Political Metaphor. And essentially what he says is The Godfather depicts the Corleone family as a representative of an earlier form of social association. He uses the term from the German sociologist Friedrich Tönnies, Gemeinschaft, which means community, as opposed to Gesellschaft, which means society. Gesellschaft is bureaucracy, the rule of law, corporation, the modern state.
Yeah, all the elements of liberal democracy and cosmopolitan liberal democracy where strangers and citizens meet each other, mediated through all sorts of institutions, and we negotiate these pluralistic differences.
Precisely. Yeah. And Gemeinschaft, community, is, blood ties, feudalism, family.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Straight up mafia, feudal kind of
thing. And he says that, the myth that The Godfather explodes is that we can live in an American society, these operations of mediation work, and we can leave behind force and fraud and all become integrated as free and equal citizens in this democracy of ours. And he says this is BS, essentially. The Godfather shows the necessity of both force and fraud, even when they have tragic consequences. It shows in the reality of politics. And I think basically what unites all of the political currents that I talk about in my book and the ones that we're seeing now, nationalism and Trump's kind of gangster populism, if you want to put it like that, is that there's a rejection of liberal democracy. There's a rejection of the kind of universalistic promises of liberal democracy. So, citizenship to all or as an ever expanding franchise. No, this needs to be cut off, retained for a few. The free market, well, that which has like non-zero sum outcomes and no, like what you need is an unfair advantage. We need to favor ours, like enough of this free trade bullshit and enough of, I don't think that, Trump is a capitalist, but he's not a free marketer. He doesn't believe in the ideology of the market. He believes in getting an unfair advantage.
That's right.
And the belief in, these bounded communities, that don't have necessarily paths to infinitely expand except by, force taking over other people or bashing other people. So, I think there's a structural analogy between, the appeal to the family as a kind of basic unit of politics and society and that of race, for example. It's like you have to protect your own. It's time to protect our own. Obviously, in the context of the United States, which is a pluralistic society, it's very difficult to make, nationalism, although it has an appeal in the United States, is a hard fit because we don't have a single ethnicity. We've always been a pluralistic country, but the rejection of that sort of patriotism that says our abstract fealty to ideals of equality and justice for all are what makes us American. No, something more elemental than that. Some bond that's either racial, ethnic, familial, or just rejects the idea that there can be non-zero sum outcomes. So you have to form some kind of gang or association and get yours.
That's right. Or in the end, right? Because there's James Caan in The Godfather, and there's, that you can join the gang.
Right.
See, this to me is the point, and you write this in that Substack piece, that the appeal is that you can be inside our gang.
Right.
And that you can get the unfair advantages, and you could have the people, you can be on the inside of the
Sure.
gang. And for a lot of people, and the gang is going to take on the people that you don't like. And that appeal, I think, is the opposite of a kind of universalist, pluralistic, liberal conception, but it has a lot of appeal, and in some ways it's elementally what we're battling against.
Yeah.
And what's key about that is that it is a little more universalist than the sheer racism of Duke, even though it has lots of those elements, because there are people who think they could be on the inside.
Right.
That it leaves open the door for them to be on the inside.
You can be to use not to take the mafia analogy too seriously, but you can be an associate of the mob and not a made man if you're not a Sicilian, for example, right? So you can have some kind of relationship with the enterprise, but you're not going to be, the center figure of it.
And this here, I'm so glad. I had no idea they were going to use this analogy. This is absolutely amazing, because this is the essence of what you see at Trump rallies even today, is this idea that they are somehow, by extension or association, they are part of the Trump mob, and they are. And this is, again, you have elected sheriffs, right? Police departments, police unions backing a convicted felon for the president. Like, the Corleone analogy fits so well, because that's, oh my god, that's so succinct. It's perfect. But anyway, this is also why I truly believe that regardless of who wins the election this year is going to be an inflection point for the growth of political violence throughout the country. It may not be, I don't actually believe there's going to be a second civil war, but there are people out there that want a civil war, and we've already seen acts since Trump has been elected with people, going to police departments. Like, what was that guy that went to the head of the FBI somewhere in the Midwest and started shooting? Didn't hit anyone and was killed, but he left a manifesto that was basically like, I'm starting the war. We're starting the war on the FBI. We're starting the war. Like, even Trump's own speeches since he lost, which he is still in denial of, have become more violent. The press is the enemy of the people, the enemy of the people, the enemy. What he means is that the enemy of anyone who is not Trump, even within the Republican Party. You see him talk about this constantly. He pisses all over people that support him, but when they lose their, races in their own state, he then tosses them aside and says well, I never liked them or whatever, even though that he, may be contradicting himself. That's the whole beauty of the Gish Gallop. But regardless, this is why I believe there's just going to be more and more violence, and why I advocate to people who do not own a firearm to get one legally, get your concealed carry legally, and do what I do, start practicing. If you can do it every weekend in your backyard, if there's laws that allow that, do it. Go to a range, whatever. But I'm just saying, just Just be ready.
So that's one way of looking at it, I suppose. You can be a friend of ours, a friend of mine, but not a friend of ours. But yeah, I think that's true, and I think that that's the struggle. Is that I think a lot of people, the assumption is that in the failure of the revelation that capitalist society is extremely competitive and people fall through the cracks is not to create institutions of broad solidarity. It's to create these
to get yours.
Institutions of what I call negative solidarity, or following Hannah Arendt, which is bounded groups that are created out of opposition to other groups. And you can have pluralism. What's interesting about this new nationalism across the world, it's pluralistic to a certain degree internationally, because there's all these little, different nation states, but it's a hostile and toxic pluralism, right? It's a war of all against all, not we all have different interests, but then, through the wonderful workings of the market and liberal democracy, they come into concert somehow. This kind of rejects the possibility of civic peace in favor of a constant ongoing kind of cold civil war, which might break out into more hostilities. So, that connects it again to Rothbard's whole conception of anarcho-capitalism. Rothbard also wrote about the Godfather, and he says mobsters are essentially anarcho-capitalists. That's what my vision of an anarcho-capitalist society would be these kind of like family concerns that are self-regulating, but they have to take care of their own, and there's no bigger framework other than the meeting of these businesses in the kind of commission to do things. So it's strange. It is a pluralistic vision, but it views a world of constant struggle, and sometimes that's understood to be different families fighting each other. Sometimes that's understood to be different races fighting each other. And sometimes that's understood to be individuals grasping for what they need. I think that basically the myth that ends, I think that the conservatives in this country, as their counter to socialism, used to provide the market as a potential utopian tool where if it was allowed to do its thing, you would get these wonderful outcomes based on.
And that's where, again, going back to Reagan, where trickle-down economics was the idea of that happening, where, this sort of Milton economic idea that an unburdened market by government red tape and regulation would allow prosperity for all, and that was the justification for the deregulation in the transportation industry via the Reagan administration. And what we found is that didn't happen at all. Actually, we're now seeing, the immediate effects were that people in the transportation industry, wages went down. So give an example, the average truck driver in 1979 made $30 an hour, right? And that went down to close to, it was almost cut in half, really, because there was no more regulation on it. So basically it expanded the ability for people to get a trucking job, but because so many were doing that and the industry itself wasn't regulated by prices, routes, whatever, it drove down the median pay. Now, how trickle-down economics people frame this, and I think there was a re-up on this where it might even been the Cato Institute put out this publication that basically said deregulation over 30 years has shown that it has saved people $6 billion. And it's yes, and that $6 billion went to the 1% who own the transportation industries. So this sort of idea, and this is ironically, this is what is feeding more and more into this tribalistic white grievance, is that somehow all these effects of deregulation and the failure of this trickle-down policy is being used and being thwarted as a tool to say, no, it wasn't trickle down, it's immigrants, it's free trade, it's the global elitists, right? Ironically, Trump being one of those. But he can fix it. Even though he was born with a silver spoon, even though he's, had enough money to dodge the draft, he was able to go to these Ivy League schools and basically eke by or have somebody else take his test or whatever it is. I have no idea how that works. but basically the Trump family, who has never had to work an actual day in their lives, um, somehow they are both represent that sort of 1% that everyone's pissed off at, but because of the way they interact with white grievance, they are the cure for it. And this sort of paradoxical nature may seem, it's obvious to me and obvious to people who are not in the cult, but that's the whole point of being in a cult, is you don't see the paradoxical nature of it. Oh, I can't, this is almost done. I can't wait to see how they wrap this up.
Its own internal operation. And essentially what I'm describing is right wingers who don't particularly believe in the magic of the marketplace, who recognize the competitive nature of capitalist society, but instead of saying, well, what do we do to obviate that? They want to create an order where you say, well, some people are the winners and some people are the losers.
That's right.
And, this is really interesting. I was recently reading for the first time, actually, Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze, which is a great book about, the Nazi economy. And it's so fascinating to see how he talks about, well, we of course know that Hitler and the Nazis had this highly ideological, racialized view of the world. But that was also their way of explaining Germany's unique position in the global capitalist world and its struggles to compete with other countries, right? That was explained in racial terms. So these things kind of turn into each other. And, I think that that's what's happening is essentially, to go back to your earlier point about the material underpinnings of this, as I don't know if I'm going to get in trouble for this on MSNBC, but, as Mark said, the rule of the market, the rule of law in a capitalist society is kind of just continuation in many ways of the rule of the jungle. And conservatives or market conservatives, market liberals say, no, that's not really true. It's not the rule of the jungle. These institutions work. And liberals and left liberals and social liberals say, well, it is a little bit, but we can mediate, we can soften that. I think this strand that I'm describing, the political phenomenon I'm describing, says it is the law of the jungle and you're going to be the biggest beast.
John Gans is the author of When the Clock Broke, Conmen, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s. He writes a Substack, Unpopular Front. John, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was great.
That was actually probably the best way to end it on, is that, as he had mentioned, everything is a zero-sum game to extremists because it's either their way or the highway. The biggest person wins. And it doesn't matter how that happens, it just tends to relate to these extremist ideologies, as we talked about with like the Mafia analogy, which I thought was absolutely beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. I hope you guys learned something. If you have any questions that I might be able, I'm not going to say I can answer every question for you. Obviously, there was a lot of material they touched on that I have glossed over, whether in history or in my own readings, but I cannot, speak as eloquently and as in depth as, someone like Chris Hayes or John Gans. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments below, and we'll see even if I have the legal means of posting something like this. If it works, great. I'll continue doing it until I am stopped, I guess.